The roar of engines swallowed the morning mist. Smoke curled over the shattered ruins of a village, twisting skyward like black ribbons of despair. Men moved through mud and rubble, faces streaked with soot and exhaustion, eyes glinting with a feral determination. The earth trembled beneath the march of mechanized death, Panzer tanks, steel monsters that had devoured everything in their path. And yet somewhere among the trembling wheat fields of Alsace, a battalion of men no larger than a heartbeat, cloaked in grime and courage, prepared to confront the inferno. They were the 761st Tank Battalion, African-American soldiers who history had all but ignored. Their mission, to pierce the armor of Hitler's most feared war machines. The ground shook, artillery screamed, and in that moment, the world held its breath, because the impossible was about to be written in fire and steel. The first light of dawn stretched across the Alsace plains like molten silver, catching on the frost-crusted barrels of Sherman tanks. The earth itself seemed to shiver under the weight of war, the skeletal remnants of bombed-out farmhouses lining the horizon like tombstones. The 761st Tank Battalion, a unit largely ignored by history until this moment, moved with a quiet precision that belied the chaos they were about to encounter. Each Sherman, polished by sweat and dirt alike, rolled forward with a mechanical hum that seemed almost sentient, as if it could sense the firestorm waiting in the valley below. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, tall and imposing even under the weight of his uniform, rode in the lead tank, his eyes scanning the misty ridges that concealed German positions. Every decision he made now would ripple through the battalion like a pulse. He knew their reputation preceded them among the Allies, whispered in hushed tones. Black soldiers entrusted with machines of death, sent to prove themselves against the Wehrmacht's finest. But to the men of the 761st, reputation was a fragile armor. What mattered was survival, and more than survival, victory. Corporal Charles Thomas adjusted the hatch of his Sherman, letting the morning air whip across his face. He could smell the damp of the soil, the iron tang of blood lingering from previous skirmishes, and the acrid scent of fuel burning in engines ahead. Beside him, Sergeant Raymond Jackson checked the tank's ammunition load, each shell a silent promise of destruction. They had trained for this, drilled for it, but nothing could fully prepare a man for the first time he saw the enemy's steel beasts, Panzer tanks, formidable and merciless, cutting through the countryside like predatory shadows. The battalion's advance was deliberate. They moved along narrow roads flanked by hedgerows that could hide entire companies of German soldiers. Scouts reported tracks in the mud fresh and deep, the unmistakable imprint of Panzers heading north to intercept them. Bates signaled a halt. The tanks formed a staggered line, hulls angled to minimize exposure while maximizing fire coverage. Every crew member knew their role, every move choreographed to a silent rhythm only understood in the heat of battle. Suddenly, the valley ahead erupted in fire. German artillery had zeroed in on their position, shells screaming through the sky before detonating with bone-rattling concussions. Mud, splintered wood, and debris flew across the frozen ground as soldiers ducked and fired in response. The 761st returned fire with unflinching precision. Sherman guns roared, spitting molten metal, striking Panzers and armored trucks in quick succession. Sparks flew as rounds hit steel. Smoke billowed in clouds that mingled with the fog, and the valley became a living nightmare of fire. Noise and chaos. Private James Wilson, barely 19, pressed himself against the hull of his tank, firing the .50 caliber machine gun at approaching infantry. He felt the vibration of each shell, heard the screams of German soldiers cut short by the roar of engines, and for the first time understood the weight of history resting on his shoulders. These men had been denied recognition, sent into segregated units that few believed capable of extraordinary feats. Yet here, in the mud and smoke, they were rewriting what it meant to fight with courage and cunning. As the battle raged, the 761st demonstrated an uncanny mastery of terrain. Using sunken roads, hedgerows, and the natural undulations of the land, they maneuvered their tanks with surprising agility, striking Panzers from unexpected angles. Explosions punctuated the quiet between shots, metal screamed as tanks were punctured, and the ground itself seemed to shudder with the passage of armored giants. Lieutenant Bates moved his command tank to a ridge scanning for vulnerable targets, issuing orders through shouted commands and hand signals, his voice carrying over the cacophony like a beacon of discipline amid the storm. Hours passed in a haze of fire and mud. For every Sherman disabled, another pressed forward. For every Panzer felled, the battalion gained hard-earned ground. The men moved with the instinct of hunters, reading the battlefield with the intuition born from months of training and combat. Each successful strike was met with a brief cheer, a nod, a silent acknowledgement of survival, but there was little time to celebrate. Another column of German armor loomed on the horizon, its black silhouettes glinting in the weak sunlight. The valley, a landscape of death and debris, had become a crucible, testing not just their skill but their very will to survive. By nightfall, the first day of combat had ended. The frozen fields were littered with wreckage, burned-out Panzers, shattered trees, and the twisted remains of buildings. The 761st had struck a blow against an enemy that believed itself invincible. Yet exhaustion weighed heavily. The men of the battalion crawled from their tanks, faces smudged with soot and grime, eyes reflecting the horrors they had witnessed. Around campfires, they shared quiet words, checked their equipment, and tended to the wounded. In the darkness, the sounds of distant artillery continued, a grim reminder that tomorrow would bring more trials. Despite the fatigue, a quiet pride settled over the men. They were pioneers in a war that had underestimated them, their courage blazing in a landscape scarred by hatred and violence. Every Sherman tank, every well-aimed shell, and every daring maneuver had contributed to a record that would soon astonish both friend and foe. They were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove their place in history, one destroyed Panzer at a time. The morning sun barely penetrated the smoke-choked horizon as the 761st Tank Battalion regrouped after their first encounter with the German Panzer divisions. The landscape was a desolate tapestry of splintered trees, shattered farmhouses, and fields scarred with craters from artillery bombardments. The ground was slick with mud, blood, and oil, each step a reminder of the fragile line between survival and annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates climbed into his command tank, eyes scanning the valley with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Every move of the battalion now had to be executed with surgical timing. Every miscalculation could mean the loss of men, machines, and momentum. The German forces were relentless. Reports from reconnaissance units indicated that the enemy had regrouped under the cover of dawn fog, their Panzer IVs and Panther tanks forming a new defensive line along the ridge that overlooked the valley. It was a choke point, perfectly designed to crush any attacking force with concentrated fire. But the 761st, hardened by months of training and fueled by a combination of necessity and pride, would not be deterred. Each soldier knew that history had its eyes on them, even if their country often did not. Corporal Charles Thomas adjusted the Sherman's optics, noting the subtle movements of enemy infantry scuttling along the ridge. Sergeant Raymond Jackson checked the ammunition supply for the tank's 75mm gun, the metallic clinks of shells providing a grim rhythm to the tense morning. Across the line, Private James Wilson and his crew crouched low, scanning the horizon for the glint of German steel. Smoke from previous engagements hung low over the fields, mingling with the rising sun to create an eerie silver haze. Every man understood that this battle would demand more than courage. It would demand ingenuity, timing, and a willingness to flirt with death itself. Bates raised his hand, signaling the advance. The battalion moved as one organism, Shermans shifting through mud and wreckage, engines groaning under the strain. The tanks were staggered, hulls angled to reduce exposure to enemy fire, tracks cutting deep furrows into the sodden earth. From the ridge, German artillery opened fire, shells screaming through the air and detonating with concussive force. Mud and debris erupted around the tanks as men braced themselves, shouting orders over the deafening roar. Smoke mingled with fog, reducing visibility to mere meters. Yet the battalion pressed forward. Every tank a moving fortress. Every shell fired a statement of defiance against a foe that had underestimated them. In the center of the line, Thomas's Sherman targeted a Panther tank attempting to flank their formation. He fired a well-aimed 75mm shell, the explosion sending fragments of metal flying across the valley. The German tank staggered, smoke billowing from its breached turret. Around him, other Shermans engaged enemy armor with deadly precision, exploiting weak points, coordinating movements through radio signals and shouted commands. The choreography of destruction was both terrifying and beautiful. a deadly dance in mud, smoke, and steel. Meanwhile, the infantry accompanying the battalion maneuvered through hedgerows and destroyed buildings, providing critical reconnaissance and support. They moved cautiously, each step calculated to avoid sniper fire and landmines, every motion synchronized with the tanks above. The synergy between man and machine was evident. Without the tanks' firepower, the infantry would struggle, but without the infantry, the tanks would be vulnerable to hidden anti-tank weapons. Together, they formed a seamless strike force capable of overwhelming even the most formidable German defenses. Hours into the engagement, a new challenge emerged. A column of German panzers, supported by artillery, attempted a flanking maneuver through a narrow gorge to the battalion's left. The Shermans responded with disciplined precision. Lieutenant Bates moved his command tank to a vantage point, directing fire with surgical accuracy. Shells exploded against Panther armor, sending twisted metal tumbling down the hillside. Smoke and fire obscured the battlefield, the air thick with the acrid scent of cordite, burning fuel, and churned earth. The sounds of engines, guns, and human voices merged into a symphony of chaos. Private Wilson, crouched in the mud beside his tank, fired relentlessly, his .50 caliber rounds tearing through German infantry, attempting to advance behind their armored column. The chaos of battle pressed upon him like a living thing. The cries of the wounded, the roar of engines, and the shriek of artillery created a sensory storm that threatened to overwhelm the senses. Yet within this storm, a strange clarity emerged. Each action, each decision carried profound weight. Every destroyed tank was a testament to skill and courage, every avoided shell a narrow reprieve from death. By midday, the battalion had turned the tide of the engagement. German armor, though formidable and numerous, was beginning to falter under the relentless pressure of coordinated Sherman strikes. The 761st exploited every vulnerability, flanking maneuvers, precision targeting of weak armor points, and timing their attacks to coincide with enemy reloads. Each success was not without cost. Tanks were damaged, men were wounded, and the valley itself became a tapestry of destruction and sacrifice. Yet the battalion pressed onward, their focus unwavering, their resolve unbroken. Amidst the carnage, individual acts of heroism stood out. Sergeant Jackson, recognizing a Panther preparing to breach the line, maneuvered his Sherman into a narrow pass, drawing enemy fire while enabling two other tanks to flank and destroy the threat. Thomas risked his life to rescue a wounded comrade, exposing himself to machine gun fire while guiding the man to safety behind the relative cover of a destroyed barn. These moments, though fleeting, encapsulated the spirit of the 761st. Men who fought not just to win battles, but to protect one another, to prove their valor in a world that often denied them recognition. As dusk fell, the battlefield transformed once again. Shadows stretched long over the cratered fields, smoke from burning tanks twisting upward into the darkening sky. The battalion had inflicted significant losses on the Germans, destroying multiple panzers and scattering enemy infantry. Yet the cost was evident. Burned-out tanks, shattered weapons, and wounded men dotted the landscape. Around the surviving Shermans, soldiers tended to the injured, repaired damaged equipment, and prepared for the inevitable continuation of combat. Despite exhaustion, a quiet sense of accomplishment settled over the battalion. They had faced an enemy that believed itself unstoppable and emerged not only intact but victorious in critical engagements. Night brought no relief. Fires from destroyed German tanks illuminated the valley, casting long flickering shadows over the surviving men. Lieutenant Bates conferred with his subordinates, plotting the next day's maneuvers, while soldiers kept watch, listening for any signs of counterattack. The 761st had proven themselves in their first major engagement, demonstrating tactical acumen, courage, and unbreakable resolve. In that valley of steel and fire, history had taken note, even if the wider world remained unaware of the extraordinary feats unfolding among the smoke and mud. The snow came silently that night, thin flakes drifting through the acrid smoke, settling on helmets, tank hulls, and the lifeless forms scattered across the valley. The battlefield, once alive with fire and motion, now lay still under a pale winter moon. The wrecks of Panzer tanks stood like blackened skeletons against the frost, their twisted turrets pointed accusingly at the sky. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, muffled by the thick air, a reminder that the war was far from over. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates stood beside his tank, his breath visible in the freezing air, He watched as medics moved between the wrecks, their flashlights flickering across faces, searching for any signs of life. Each cry, each cough, each faint movement in the dark carried the weight of the day's violence. Bates had led his men through one of the most brutal armored engagements of the campaign, but he knew the next would be worse. The 761st Tank Battalion was ordered to push deeper into German-held territory through a narrow corridor near Morville-les-Vicq, where the enemy had fortified every approach. It was not just a tactical objective. It was a statement of faith from the higher command, proof that the Black Panthers, as the battalion called themselves, could accomplish what others could not. The nickname had become both a symbol and a burden. On their tanks, the image of a crouching Black Panther, muscles tensed and eyes burning with feral defiance, seemed to watch over them as they prepared for the next onslaught. Corporal Charles Thomas had barely slept. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline of the previous battle, and the faint smell of diesel and blood clung to his clothes. Inside the tank, condensation gathered on the metal walls, dripping slowly onto the ammunition boxes stacked near the gunner's seat. Sergeant Raymond Jackson sat opposite him, running a cloth over his sidearm, each motion deliberate, ritualistic. The crew spoke little. Words seemed meaningless in the space between survival and death. Outside, the mechanics worked under dim lanterns, repairing tracks, replacing damaged barrels, and rearming the Shermans for another day in hell. Before dawn, Bates gathered his officers around a field map spread across the hood of a Jeep. The plan was audacious. A direct assault through a narrow forest corridor where German armor and anti-tank guns were entrenched. Intelligence suggested at least 2 Panzer companies and a regiment of infantry held the line. It was a suicide mission on paper, but Bates had no choice. The Allies needed that corridor to open the road toward the Saar River, a crucial step in cutting off German reinforcements. The morning broke with a blood-red horizon. Mist clung to the ground, heavy and damp, carrying the smell of mud and diesel fuel. The battalion rolled out in formation, their tanks rumbling through the frozen fields, treads grinding against the brittle earth. The forest loomed ahead, its trees black and skeletal, branches clawing at the sky like fingers of the dead. Each man inside the steel belly of his tank felt the same unspoken dread, that this would be the battle that defined them, for better or worse. As they entered the tree line, the silence was shattered by the crack of German 80mm guns. Shells screamed through the air, slamming into trees, exploding in showers of splinters and fire. The Shermans responded instantly, guns rotating, returning fire with thunderous blasts. The forest became a storm of noise and chaos. Branches snapped, trees fell, the ground erupted in geysers of dirt and smoke. Communication was nearly impossible. Static filled the radios, punctuated by shouted commands and bursts of gunfire. Corporal Thomas fired round after round, targeting muzzle flashes through the smoke. Each shot sent tremors through the tank, the recoil rattling his teeth. Sergeant Jackson reloaded with practiced efficiency, his movements automatic despite the chaos. Through the periscope, Thomas glimpsed a Panther tank emerging from behind a ridge, its cannon swinging toward them. He fired. The shell struck the Panther's lower glacis, penetrating the armor. Flames burst from the hatch and a figure clambered out, burning, screaming. The crew watched in grim silence. The battle stretched into hours. The narrow forest corridor became a death trap, a labyrinth of fire and wreckage. Tanks maneuvered through fallen trees, over trenches, and across makeshift barricades. The 761st fought with ferocity, using every advantage, flanking through gaps, coordinating fire to overwhelm single targets, and relying on their grit to push through. The Panthers, though superior in armor and gunpowder, began to falter under the relentless pressure. Yet the cost was staggering. Dozens of men fell. Tanks were abandoned, their crews forced to fight on foot. The forest itself seemed to conspire against them. Thick mud sucked at the treads, smoke-blinded gunners, and shattered trees blocked escape routes. Through it all, Bates's voice came over the radio, calm, commanding, unbroken. "Keep your line. Keep your fire. The only way out is through." By afternoon, the German defense began to collapse. One by one, the Panzers fell silent, their wrecks burning among the trees. The 761st broke through the final defensive line, emerging from the forest into open fields scarred by shellfire. Snowflakes mixed with ash as the tanks rolled onward, engines growling like beasts freed from a cage. The corridor was theirs, a narrow strip of ground won through blood, courage, and unrelenting determination. When the shooting stopped, the silence felt almost unreal. Men climbed from their tanks, faces blackened with soot, eyes hollow with exhaustion. The snow, once white, was now streaked with soot and blood. Sergeant Jackson lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the flame flickering against the wind. Thomas leaned against the side of his Sherman, staring at the distant horizon where smoke still rose. They had survived, but at a cost no victory could ever fully repay. As medics moved among the wrecks, Bates walked through the aftermath. He paused beside a destroyed Sherman, its turret blown clean off, and saluted the fallen crew. "They'll remember this," he said quietly to no one in particular, "even if it takes years." That night, as the men rested in the captured valley, the sound of the wind through the trees mingled with distant explosions. The 761st had done the impossible, again, but in the flickering firelight, as soldiers sat in silence or whispered prayers, they knew the war was not yet done with them. Ahead lay new towns, new battlefields, and the relentless grind of history. They were no longer just a battalion. They were a legend being written in real time, forged in fire, blood, and steel. The wind howled across the plains of northeastern France, carrying the sharp scent of gunpowder and the faint echo of distant explosions. The land stretched wide and wounded, fields churned into a sea of mud, villages reduced to skeletal ruins, churches standing like broken sentinels over graves that had no markers. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the war had become a rhythm, not of days and nights, but of battles and silences between them. It was late December 1944. Snow fell in thick, wet sheets that clung to uniforms and froze to the metal skin of the Shermans. The roads were treacherous, slick with ice and littered with the carcasses of burned-out vehicles. Yet the battalion pressed on, each mile a brutal testament to endurance. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates rode at the head of the column, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Germany awaited, cold, fortified, and unyielding. Behind him, the tanks advanced in grim silence, their engines muffled by the snow. Every man inside those steel beasts carried the fatigue of months of combat. Sleepless nights, meals eaten cold, the constant stench of fuel and sweat. And beneath it all, a quiet anger, not just at the enemy, but at a world that doubted their right to fight for freedom. The news from the north was dire. The Germans had launched a desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Allied forces were stretched thin, and the front was a jagged, bleeding line. The 761st was ordered to move toward Bastogne, to reinforce the collapsing positions and prevent the enemy from breaking through. It was the kind of mission given to the desperate and the dependable, and the 761st was both. As they moved through the Ardennes, the world around them transformed into a frozen nightmare. The forests loomed thick and dark, the roads barely visible beneath the snow. German artillery pounded from hidden ridges, their shells tearing through the treetops, raining splinters and death. The battalion responded with precision, Shermans fanning out, guns swiveling toward the flashes of enemy fire. Inside one of the lead tanks, Corporal Charles Thomas tightened his gloves, breath steaming against the cold metal of the periscope. Sergeant Raymond Jackson sat beside him, muttering a low prayer before slamming another shell into the breech. The tank shuddered as they fired, the recoil echoing through their bones. Outside visibility was almost zero. The snow turned the world into a white void punctuated by flame and smoke. The enemy struck hard. Panzerfausts streaked through the air, impacting against the Sherman's armor with explosive force. One tank ahead of Thomas erupted in a ball of fire, its turret spinning off into the snow. "Keep moving!" Bates's voice thundered over the radio. "Don't stop for anything." The battalion surged forward, tracks grinding over debris, guns blazing. For hours they fought through ambush after ambush, in the forests, in the narrow roads, in the ruined villages that dotted the Ardennes. The Germans, desperate and cornered, fought with fanatic determination, but the 761st matched them shot for shot, maneuver for maneuver. They had learned the language of survival, the instincts that separated the living from the fallen. When night came, the sky glowed faintly from the fires of burning tanks. Snow continued to fall, covering the dead in a cold, indifferent shroud. The battalion bivouacked in the remains of a bombed-out village. Soldiers huddled around small fires, rubbing their hands for warmth. Some prayed, Some stared into the flames, seeing faces of friends who wouldn't see another dawn. Bates moved among them, offering words of steel. Not comfort, but purpose. "We're not done yet," he said. "They think they can hold the Rhine. They think we'll stop at the border. They're wrong." Over the next days, the battalion advanced again, through Luxembourg and into Germany itself. The border crossing was both symbolic and surreal. Snowdrifts buried the road signs. The forests were silent except for the crunch of tank treads. When the first Sherman crossed into German territory, a cheer went up over the radios, short-lived but heartfelt. For the men of the 761st who had grown up in a segregated America, to drive the enemy back into their homeland carried a power few could put into words. As they approached the Rhine, resistance grew fiercer. The German defenses stiffened, artillery batteries entrenched along the riverbanks. Bridges were rigged with explosives. Towns like Tilly and Tilly-sur-Seure became fortresses of rubble and snipers. The battalion fought street by street, house by house, each encounter a blur of smoke, shattered glass, and echoing gunfire. Corporal Thomas's tank was struck by an anti-tank round near a stone church on the outskirts of Tillet. The impact threw him against the turret, blood filling his mouth. Jackson shouted orders, returning fire while smoke poured into the cabin. The crew bailed out, dragging Thomas with them, bullets snapping overhead. They took cover behind the church wall as the Sherman exploded behind them, flames illuminating the snow like sunrise through hell. Medics reached them minutes later. Thomas, dazed and bleeding, refused evacuation. "We finished the job," he muttered, his breath freezing in the air. His eyes were defiant, the same eyes that had stared down the barrels of German Panzers and refused to blink. He would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day, one of the first African-American soldiers in the war to receive it. The fight for Tillet raged through the night. The battalion's tanks moved like ghosts through the smoke, their silhouettes illuminated by tracer fire. The Germans fought to the last man, but the 761st was relentless. By dawn, the town was theirs. The Rhine, glinting like molten steel under the winter sun, was visible in the distance. Standing atop his tank, Bates watched the river through binoculars. The bridge ahead, the last major crossing before Frankfurt, was heavily defended. He knew the cost it would take to secure it. But he also knew his men were ready. They had faced the worst the enemy could offer and endured. "We cross tomorrow," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes." That night, as the battalion prepared for the assault, the air was still except for the low rumble of engines and the crackle of radio static. Snowflakes drifted through the glow of burning buildings, landing softly on helmets and gun barrels. Some men wrote letters by candlelight, words to wives, to mothers, to futures they hoped might still exist. Others sat in silence, the war too vast, too loud for speech. When dawn came, the Black Panthers roared to life. Engines thundered, treads churned the snow, and the 761st surged toward the Rhine. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the fiercest in the battalion's history. Tanks dueling across open ground, artillery lighting the skies, men advancing through fire to secure a bridge that symbolized not just victory, but vindication. For hours the riverbanks burned, smoke billowed in towering plumes as Shermans clashed with Panzers at close range. Explosions rocked the earth, scattering snow and debris into the air. Bates's command tank was hit, its side armor sheared away, but he refused to retreat. "Push through!" he shouted, voice hoarse through the static. "Push them into the river!" By dusk, the bridge was theirs. The 761st had crossed the Rhine. The men stood on the far bank silent, watching the river flow beneath them. A river that had seen centuries of empires rise and fall, now bearing the reflection of tanks and men who had changed history. The wind was cold, the world quiet except for the distant rumble of retreating German engines. Sergeant Jackson looked at Thomas, who leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch. "We did it," he said simply. Thomas nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. "We did more than that." They had crossed not just a river, but a barrier far greater, one built of prejudice, doubt, and centuries of silence. The world would remember the victory, but those who had lived it would remember the price. The Rhine was behind them, a gray, endless current winding through the heart of a dying empire. Beyond it stretched the final miles of war, where victory waited like a mirage on the horizon. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, had crossed into Germany, leaving behind the frozen hell of the Ardennes and the shattered towns of France. Ahead lay towns whose names were spoken with dread: Mannheim, Coburg, Günzburg, Shire. Each one another fortress, another test, another wound. By March 1945, the world was collapsing in on itself. The Third Reich was bleeding out, but its claws still cut deep. Columns of refugees clogged the roads, civilians pushing carts, children wrapped in blankets, faces hollowed by hunger and fear. Smoke curled from distant ruins where the Luftwaffe once ruled the skies. Now only Allied bombers drifted above, their shadows sweeping across the broken land like omens. For the 761st, every sunrise brought movement. Orders came fast: advance, clear, secure. The Sherman tanks rumbled through bombed-out streets, their tracks crushing glass, their guns swiveling toward every window. Sniper fire cracked from rooftops. Machine guns barked from cellar doors, and still they pressed on. Inside his command tank, Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates read the latest communique. Link up with the 71st Infantry Division. Secure Günzburg. Proceed to the Danube. He folded the paper, his face unreadable. Around him, the men of the 761st were a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Months of combat had carved them into something more than soldiers. They were survivors, steel-bound and soul-worn, driven by something far larger than orders. Among them rode Sergeant Ruben Rivers' replacement commander, a quiet man named Lieutenant Jack McLeod, whose eyes still carried the ghost of every man they'd lost. Corporal Charles Thomas, limping but unbroken, sat again in his tank, the smell of oil and cordite familiar as breath. He shouldn't have been there, and he was still healing, but there was no force on earth that could have kept him away from his crew. The final drive. The battalion rolled eastward under skies bruised with smoke. German resistance was sporadic now, desperate. The once proud Wehrmacht was splintering, pockets of diehards clinging to the belief that they could still hold the line. But the 761st had learned too much, lost too much to slow down now. Outside Coburg, they engaged a convoy of German armored vehicles retreating north. The air thundered with explosions as the Shermans fanned out across the hills. Rivers of black smoke twisted into the clouds. The enemy's Panzers, the same machines that had once struck terror into Allied ranks, now burned like torches against the horizon. Every hit, every victory was paid for in blood. Private Harold Porter's tank was ambushed near a narrow bridge. A Panzerfaust struck their left track, immobilizing them. The crew bailed out under fire, dragging Porter, whose leg was shattered by shrapnel. They fought their way back across the bridge, firing as they retreated, while Thomas's tank provided covering fire. The enemy was relentless, but the Black Panthers did not break. By dusk, the bridge was theirs, at the cost of 6 men. That night, in the ruins of a farmhouse, they buried the fallen beneath shattered timbers. There was no ceremony, no words, just the cold wind and the distant sound of artillery echoing across the valley. The next day, they crossed into Bavaria. The towns were smaller now, the faces more frightened. German soldiers surrendered in groups, boys barely 16, old men dragged from their homes. Some waved white sheets from windows. Others refused to yield, firing until they were silenced. The war was ending, but it did not feel like peace. The gates of Hellet was April 1945 when the 761st received new orders. Advance toward Gunskirchen. Secure the area and report any enemy resistance. They didn't know what they were driving into. The forest road narrowed, lined with trees whose branches hung low over the muddy path. The smell hit them first, thick, acrid, and unmistakable. Not gunpowder, not oil. Something worse, something human. As the lead tank broke through the clearing, the men saw it, a camp. Barbed wire twisted around watchtowers, barracks sagging under the weight of decay. Figures moved inside the fence, thin, ghost-like shapes in tattered clothing. The closer they came, the more the horror unfolded. Bodies piled like firewood, eyes staring from skulls that no longer looked alive. The men of the 761st, hardened by months of slaughter, fell silent. They had found Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of Mauthausen, one of the Nazi death camps. Thousands of prisoners had been left to starve as the Germans fled. The air itself seemed poisoned by death. Lieutenant McLeod climbed from his tank, stepping carefully through the mud and bones. A prisoner, barely standing, reached out to him, his hands trembling, his lips forming words in a language McLeod couldn't understand. He took the man's hand anyway, gripping it tight. "Get medics up here," he said hoarsely into his radio. "Now." The battalion poured into the camp. Men who had seen every horror war could conjure now faced something beyond it. They tore down the gates, broke open the barracks, handed out what little rations they had. Some of the liberated prisoners wept openly. Others simply stared, too weak to believe it was over. That day, the Black Panthers, a unit that had fought its own war within a war, became liberators. The last days and the weeks that followed, the 761st pressed on into Austria. The German army was collapsing in every direction. Cities burned, bridges fell, surrender flags fluttered like ghosts in the wind. By early May 1945, they reached Steyr, where they linked up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The men stood in stunned silence as Red Army soldiers, dirty, gaunt, and equally exhausted, approached across the ruins of the bridge. There was no triumph, only understanding. The war in Europe was ending. On May 8, 1945, the radio crackled with the words they had all waited to hear. "Germany has surrendered. The war is over." For a long time, no one spoke. Then someone, maybe Thomas, maybe Jackson, and whispered, "We made it." But the celebration was muted. They had buried too many, seen too much. The long road home, when the men of the 761st returned to America, they did not find the parades or the open arms they deserved. The war they fought overseas ended, but another one, quieter, crueler, continued at home. They were sent back to segregated units, denied medals, denied recognition, denied the dignity they had earned. Some were refused service in the very diners they had liberated Europe to protect. But history, slow though it may be, has a way of catching up. Decades later, the truth began to surface. Reports, testimonies, eyewitness accounts, all telling of the 761st's heroism. The tanks that had broken the Siegfried Line, the men who had crossed the Rhine, the liberators of Gunskirchen. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion, over 30 years late, but finally acknowledging what the world could never forget. And in 1997, after more than half a century, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, who had given his life leading his men through France, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Epilogue. The legacy of the Black Panthers' time has taken most of them now. The tanks rust in museums, their paint faded, their names barely legible. But the story remains, carved into history like tracks in frozen mud. The men of the 761st fought two wars, one against tyranny abroad and another against prejudice at home. They won both. Somewhere in the archives there is a photograph, a grainy black and white frame showing a group of young black soldiers standing beside their tanks, snow falling around them. Their faces are tired, their uniforms stained, but their eyes burn with quiet pride. That photograph is not just history. It is proof. Proof that courage knows no color. That heroism is not born from privilege but from purpose. And that freedom, for all its weight, for all its cost, is worth every mile, every battle, every drop of blood shed on foreign soil. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, they fought for a country that didn't yet fight for them, and in doing so they changed it forever.